You know, most of us have dealt with some form of family drama. Maybe it's siblings that don't speak to each other. Maybe it's that crazy uncle, crazy aunt that a lot of us probably have, that every time we get together at any party or any holiday gathering, somehow, some way, he's going to stir the pot just a little bit. He's going to cause a little drama. Somewhere along the way, sometimes in our families, words have been said, things have been done, and now because of that, we do not speak to each other. And it's easy to think sometimes that our family is the only one that's just a tiny bit crazy. It's just the only one that's a little bit off our rocker. No one else here has ever dealt with any sort of family drama. And then we open our Bibles to the book of Genesis, the very first book in the Bible, and we find out very quickly that our family is not the only one that dealt with a little bit of drama. Some of the most dramatic family events in all of human history are found in the book of Genesis. I mean, we see Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Hagar going back and forth, and they can't seem to get along. And then Isaac, Abraham's son, has a favorite son named Esau, and Rebekah, his wife, has her favorite son, Jacob. And as you can imagine, when parents play favorites, there's a little bit of a sibling rivalry. There's some family drama in that family. And those two, Jacob and Esau, never seem to get along. And in the next generation, that's Jacob, repeats the same mistake. He has a favorite wife. He has a favorite son. He repeats the same mistake. And there's even more family drama. It doesn't take long in the book of Genesis for us to realize that this is one seriously dysfunctional family. Joseph's family is like so many families in our world today, and maybe, quite frankly, even our own, that deals with a lot of drama. And yet, despite all their drama, despite all their dysfunction, God is able to use this family, the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, to bring his Savior into the world. And I think that's a powerful reminder for all of us that God is sovereign over every situation. That God has the power, God's grace is so amazing that he can even use a messed up family like the one we read about in Genesis to accomplish his saving purposes in the world. And so what I'd like to do this evening is just look at the life of Joseph. Walk through the 13 or 14 chapters there at the end of Genesis that deal with his life and his legacy, and look at really three simple ways we see God's sovereignty in the life of Joseph. Joseph begins at the very beginning by telling us a little bit about that family drama. There in verse 2 of chapter 27, Genesis chapter 37 in verse 2, the text tells us that at 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wife, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Very quickly there in Genesis chapter 37, we learn a little bit about Joseph. That Joseph is a little bit of a tattletale. That he sees his brothers, or his stepbrothers, we would call them today, and goes back to his dad and said, "Hey, Dad, do you realize what your kids are doing?" He tells on his brothers. But that's not all. There in the next verse, there in chapter 37 and verse 3, it tells us that Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a long-sleeved robe for him. Your translation there may say multicolor robed or a coat of many colors. Really, there's not a lot of consistency in how to translate that. They're really uncertain on how to translate that. That's why there's a difference between translations there. You see, Joseph's brothers there in the text, they know what's going on. They see the robe. They know why they have that robe. They know that robe means that their brother is the favorite. And as you can imagine, that does not go over too well with his brothers. We might even say today that there's some bad blood between Joseph and his brothers. But it goes on there in the text. And Joseph there in chapter 37 and verse 6 has this dream. And in this dream, Joseph tells his brothers this: "Listen to this dream I had. There we were binding sheaves of grain in the field, and suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." "Are you going to reign over us?" his brothers ask him. They immediately realize what this dream means. Are you really, verse 8, going to rule over us? So they hated him even more because of the dream and what he had said. Then Joseph throws a little more gasoline on that fire in verse 9, and he has another dream and told his brothers, "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father and his brothers, and his fathers rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this you have had?" he said. "Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come down and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers, verse 11, were jealous of him. But his father kept the matter in mind. As you can imagine, again, that these two dreams that Joseph has made his brothers hate him even more. That they were pretty mean to Joseph, so much so that one day comes while out in the field, and Joseph comes to them. And they make the decision while they're out in the field, we're going to strip Joseph of his favorite robe. That long sleeve robe, your translation again may say coat of many colors, and we're going to sell him into slavery. Joseph's status was gone. But now, even though that Joseph had been sold into slavery, we see there in Genesis chapter 39 that God is still in control. That even though at this point in Joseph's life, he's in another country far away from his family, God is still in control. There in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 2, it tells us, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful." One of the things we see there in Genesis chapter 39, if we were to read the entire chapter tonight, is that something like 7 times there in the chapter, the text tells us the Lord was with him, God was with him, God was blessing Joseph. And so very quickly we see the first thing that we can take away from the life of Joseph: that God is sovereign over status. That's the first way we see God's sovereignty in the life of Joseph. That God was sovereign when Joseph was the favored son, living in his father's house. But God was also sovereign when he was a slave in Egypt. And God was still with him. And because God was still with Joseph, even when he was a slave in Egypt, he could endure slavery. Because God was with Joseph when he was down in Egypt, Joseph, even though he was far from home, was never alone. And I think this should be a message of hope for us. That when we feel alone, when we are facing our darkest hours, that God is still with us. In the moments when it feels like nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows my sorrow, God is still there. And Joseph understood that. Later in his life, when Potiphar's wife comes to Joseph and says, "Joseph, lie with me, sleep with me," Joseph replies there to Potiphar's wife there in the text, there in verses 8 and 9. He refuses. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God? That even though Joseph is far from home, even though he's away from his family and friends, Joseph still recognizes that God is in control, that God sees. And it would be a sin against God for Joseph to sleep with Potiphar's wife. Probably a good thing for us to keep in mind here, that God is sovereign over status. That no matter if we are a slave, no matter if we are the favorite son, God is still sovereign over everything. That we need to trust in God like Joseph trusts in God here in the text, even when it may cost us everything. That it doesn't matter if we are that favored son or that slandered slave, we need to trust that God is in control. And if we find ourselves at a point in our life where we may be stripped of status, we need to remember that God is in control. But even though there in the text, as Joseph's story progresses, Joseph lived with integrity and trusted in God's sovereignty, he's still thrown in prison. Potiphar gets mad and throws him in prison. But even in jail, God is with Joseph. And so the next thing we see in Joseph's life is that God is sovereign over suffering. That God could even use suffering to glorify him. About 4 or 5 years ago, a tornado ripped through Cookeville, Tennessee. Killed something like 20 or 30 people in Cookeville. And among the people who were killed during that tornado were an entire family, a daughter, a husband, daughter and wife, a husband and son, and their child. The daughter was the daughter of a local preacher there in Cookeville, Tennessee. And in the days and weeks that followed, CBS News actually came down to the little town of Cookeville, Tennessee, and interviewed the father. And the father's interview was played on all of CBS News at various points. And even though he had lost his daughter and his grandson and his son-in-law, this preacher, this man of faith, used that opportunity to glorify God. That even though he was suffering this immense tragedy, he still found a way to glorify God. And what I hope we see here in the life of Joseph is that same mentality. That even though Joseph is suffering as a slave in Egypt, Joseph still finds a way to glorify God. And in fact, Genesis chapter 39 and verse 21 tells us this. That the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. And the warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. And he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And the Lord made everything that he did successful. We see here in Genesis chapter 39, as Joseph is in prison, that God is still with him. And as Joseph's story continues there into Genesis chapter 40 and to 41, two of his fellow prisoners one day have a dream. And they come and they tell their dream to Joseph. And Joseph says there in chapter 40 and verse 8, he replies, he gives glory to God and says, don't interpretations belong to God? That even though he is suffering, and he is suffering unjustly, Joseph still recognizes God is in control. And so the cupbearer tells this dream there in verse 9, 10, and 11. He talks about how this dream, in his dream, there was this vine and 3 branches, and he squeezed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup. And then Joseph there in verse 12 interprets the dream. He tells the cupbearer this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand the way you used to when you were in his cupbearer. But when all goes well for you remember the kindness that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Joseph interprets the dream and then has that small request. Please, Joseph says, remember me. But 2 years go by, and Joseph is still in prison. He's still suffering. But Pharaoh then has a dream, and no one can interpret that dream. And then light bulbs go off in the cupbearer's mind. He goes, hey, there's this guy in prison. Maybe he can interpret your dream. And so Joseph is called before Pharaoh, and at this time, Pharaoh is the most powerful ruler in the ancient world. And Joseph tells the Pharaoh this in chapter 41 and verse 16, that I am not able to interpret the dream. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is God who will give a favorable answer. That even though Joseph has continued to suffer and suffer unjustly, he still recognizes that God is in control. And he interprets that dream there for Pharaoh. And that dream is basically of 7 lean calves eating the 7 fat calves, and the 7 lean sheaves eating the 7 fat sheaves. And he interprets that dream and says, by the way, this is what that dream means. That dream means we're going to have 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh, here's what you need to do. You need to set aside during the years of plenty so that when the years of famine come, we have enough food to survive. Sounds pretty good to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh appoints Joseph as second in command in the most powerful nation in the world. The favored son who became a slandered prisoner is now an exalted ruler. We're starting to see the grace of God in the suffering of Joseph. And that even though Joseph has suffered, and suffered tremendously, God is still in control, and God is still finding a way to bless Joseph. God uses Joseph's suffering to prepare him and lead him to a greater place and a greater purpose. Sometimes that happens to us today. That we may go through trials and tribulations, and we may suffer, and we may go, why? Why in the world am I suffering this way? Why do I have so many bad things or hard things come back in my life? And then like 5 or 10 or 15 years later, we go, oh, that's why. That the suffering we go through sometimes prepares us for a greater purpose. But I think it's also helpful for us to remember that the sufferings of this life do not compare to the ultimate glory that we will experience as children of God. And I don't know about you, but remembering that God is sovereign even over suffering, that God has a better place prepared for us, is a message of hope. That even though we may go through suffering in this life, even though we may be diagnosed with cancer, we may lose our job, we may lose our status, we may be persecuted, we may endure so many forms of persecution, remembering that God is still in control is a message of hope. Because there's this temptation for us as we experience suffering to want to turn away from God, to abandon God, to think that God is no longer in control because we are suffering. But Joseph reminds us that God is still in control and God still cares about us. As Joseph's life continues, there in the book of Genesis, the years of plenty come and go, and now the famine comes. And the famine gets so bad all throughout the ancient world that Joseph's family, his brothers, are forced to come to Egypt to get food. It's a pretty long journey just to get food, but they had to get food to survive. And Joseph spots his brothers immediately. He recognizes them, and he begins to think to himself, I knew you were trouble when you walked in. He knows what's going on with his brothers. He thinks they're spies, and there's this whole extended dialogue between Joseph and his brothers that we won't get into tonight. And eventually, after kind of testing his brothers a little bit, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and his reaction is shocking. When most of us would have looked at our brothers and our sisters and would have said, karma's going to get you. You were wrong to me. I'm going to get you back. That's not what Joseph does. Joseph weeps. And he tells his brother in Genesis chapter 45 in verse 5. He says, don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For this famine has been in the land 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. Joseph realizes in verse 7 that God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. That's the third thing we learn here in Joseph's life, there in Genesis chapter 45, that God is sovereign over salvation. You see, Joseph can look back at his life and where his life has taken him and realize, as the text tells us there in verse 7, that God sent him down there, and God did that so he could provide salvation through Joseph for all of God's people. Yes, his brothers had sold him into slavery, but God's power is so great that he could use their sin to accomplish their salvation. Joseph begins to see the larger picture in his life. You know, sometimes as we think about our life, it's kind of like a flight, a nice long commercial flight. And a lot of times those flights go well, right? It's pretty smooth, pretty easy. But every so often you're on your flight and you hear the pilot come over the loudspeaker and go, okay, guys, we're going to hit some turbulence, so make sure you're buckled up. And so you make sure you're buckled up and everything. And before you know it, you're on a roller coaster ride at 40,000 feet. And if you've ever gone through that turbulence, you wonder how in the world could the pilot be so calm? Like your plane's going up and down, the wings are flapping like a bird, and you're wondering how in the world could a pilot be calm in this situation? Well, the pilot's calm in that situation because he knows the plane can take it. And he knows how to guide the plane through the storm. And it's the same way with our lives. That our God sees the bigger picture. And he knows how to guide us through the storms. God is sovereign over our salvation. And that's what Joseph realized as he looked at his life. That he begins to realize that God has brought him down to Egypt for a greater purpose. The salvation of many souls. So much so that when Joseph gets to the end of his life and their father has died, he looks at his brothers and says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I'm not going to take judgment on you. You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival or the salvation of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. Joseph got to the end of his life, and even though so many bad things had happened to him, he recognized that God had been in control the entire time. Joseph begins to realize there at the end of his life that what was a victory for sin turned out to be part of God's saving plan. That God was able to use his suffering to bring about the salvation of his family. And that's what we see there in the gospel. How we see there in the gospel of Jesus Christ, how Jesus, the only Son of God, emptied himself of status, took the form of a servant, was stripped of his clothes, suffered on a cross, even though he was innocent, and he died to provide salvation for all people. And now all we need to do is to trust and obey. Maybe you're going through some storms in your life. You're going through some rough times in your life. You're suffering. You're beginning to wonder, does God love me? Does God still care about me? Should I even believe in God? The life of Joseph, the legacy of Joseph should remind us that God is still in control, even in those moments when we are suffering. But maybe we're here tonight and our faith is weak and we need some prayers. If we can help you with that, if we help strengthen your faith, if we can encourage you in any ways, please let us know while together we stand and sing.